morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all, wherever you are in the world. And welcome back to the Thursday Talks for a very special edition of the Thursday Talks. This is our first ever Thursday Talk under the branding of ConnexUs. Yes, you heard that right. Theming for Peace is now ConnexUs. We are going to take the lessons and really build on the success of the last 10 years to create a new future for our platform. We're still working on learning and connection, but we're working on placing peace and security at the heart of a community of sectors that are both working in conflict-affected contexts and trying to make a positive impact in their community. You can join the fun over at www.cnxus.org, and that link will be in your chat box in just a moment. For those of you who are new to the Thursday Talks, my name is Jack Farrell, and I am the Manager for Partnerships and Strategic Innovation at Search for Common Ground, and I'm going to be your host today. I'm delighted to be joined by Jessica Duque of the Institute for Economics and Peace, who is going to lead a discussion on the Global Terrorism Index. Just a note, if you have a question during today's discussion, you can write it on the question or chat function on your GoToWebinar dashboard, and I will make sure that we address it during today's session. I'm now going to hand over to today's guest, Jessica. You're very welcome back to the Thursday Talks. How are you doing today?
I'm good, Jack. It's great to be back. This is my first time participating in the Thursday Talks, but IEP has spoken before, and so I'm really excited to delve into this presentation and discussion of findings from the 2022 Global Terrorism Index. So an overview of my presentation today, I'll just walk you through key findings of the report, and afterwards I'm happy to answer any questions you may have about the methodology or about any of our findings. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, IEP is an Australian think tank, and we are dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peacefulness and as well as the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. So we're probably best known for our global indices, including the Global Peace Index and of course the Global Terrorism Index. We produce a number of reports each year, but also have a number of peace education programs that you are of course free to check out. This slide here is really meant to demonstrate the significant reach that IEP has been fortunate enough to have. Today's report, as well as the PowerPoint presentation that I am showing you, they're all available to read for free on our website. Okay, great. So now that introductions are over, I'm happy to dive straight into the findings of the report. So this is the 9th edition of the Global Terrorism Index, and the report itself measures 163 countries, and the scores that they receive reflect the impact of terrorism for the previous year. So this report is developed and written by a research team based in Sydney, and it's also used as an indicator for our Global Peace Index. The database that we use to calculate country scores comes from the terrorism tracker produced by Dragonfly, which is a private intelligence company. So from the terrorism tracker, we calculate the total number of terrorist incidents, the number of fatalities, injuries, and hostages within a given year. So this gray box right here shows how we weight them. Deaths obviously having the largest weight and score, but also included in the weighting system is a 5-year impact, which essentially aims to kind of account for the long-term effects, both economic and psychological effects that a terrorist attack will have years after the attack itself is carried out. So these scores are then banded, and then countries on the index would receive a score between 1 to 10, higher numbers meaning the higher impact of terrorism. And then beyond the actual, ranking of countries, the Global Terrorism Index also includes analysis on a number of socio-economic indicators related to terrorism that I'll kind of present later on in the presentation. And then in terms of defining terrorism and the definition that sort of grounds the report, we recognize that there are a lot of varying definitions of terrorism within this space. And so we use the same definition that Dragonfly uses, which you could see at the top. And so in terms of, defining attacks or incidents or certain kind of aspects of terrorism, that's kind of the definition that grounds us in our research. So in terms of this year's results, as an overview, here are the results of the GTI on a map. And the second map that I'll be here shows where the deadliest terrorist attacks occurred within 2021. The two deadliest attacks in 2021 occurred in both in Afghanistan and Burkina Faso. And then in terms of the 10 most impacted countries, here they are, as you can see on the list. And so Afghanistan is the most impacted country from terrorism, and it has been for the third consecutive year. So in terms of top level findings, deaths from terrorism decreased by 1.2%, whereas the number of attacks increased by 17%. So although terrorist attacks have seen an increase, we are finding that they are not as deadly. 86 countries recorded an improvement and 19 deteriorated. And I would say that the two largest findings of the GTI is that terrorism is becoming more and more concentrated into conflict zones. This includes the Sahel region, which has seen an increase in deaths 10 times more than it has in the past 2 decades. Deaths in both sub-Saharan Africa and the MENA region are continuing to decline. Between 2020 and 2021, deaths by Boko Haram actually declined by 72%. And then in terms of emerging groups, we saw that JNIM, formed in the Sahel region, is the fastest growing group, and that ISWA, the Islamic State of West Africa, is the most lethal group recorded this year, with an average of 15 deaths per attack. And one important finding to note in this year's GTI is that only 52% of attacks were attributed to a specific group. So the terrorism tracker itself recorded about 5,200 attacks in 2021, and so that 48% of attacks were not attributed to a specific group, but were instead categorized by the ideology that the perpetrator exhibited. Attacks in the West have fallen substantially by about 70% in the last 4 years. And then in terms of larger trends, we've seen more politically motivated incidents than religiously motivated ones in the past 5 years. And then the country with the largest increase in terrorism in 2021 was Myanmar, and the country with the largest improvement was Mozambique. And I'd be happy to kind of delve into these countries a little bit further later on in the presentation. And so this chart here is a breakdown of the countries where the most deaths occurred within 2021. So as mentioned, we did see a slight dip in deaths. Overall, about 7,100 recorded deaths from terrorism within the past year. The 5 countries with the highest deaths, as you can see, include Afghanistan, Burkina Faso, Somalia, Mali, and Niger. And so deaths in those countries unfortunately increased by 21%, but deaths overall have decreased in all other countries on the GTI. Once again, kind of reinforcing the finding that terrorism is becoming more concentrated in conflict zones. This slide here is one of the more positive slides that I'd like to share, which shows that regionally terrorism is improving. The only region to deteriorate is sub-Saharan Africa. Later on in this presentation, I did intend to share some findings from the Russia and Ukraine conflict, but we do see in this chart that between 2020 and 2021, specifically, Russia and the Eurasia region did have the largest improvement on the impact of terrorism. Unfortunately, that is expected to change within the next iteration of the GTI, and I'm sure we're all looking to see how that might impact the data. So here are the countries with the largest increase in deaths from terrorism between 2020 and 2021. As mentioned, Myanmar did have the largest increase in deaths, mostly due to the violence surrounding the military coup. There are several attacks listed within this time period in which no particular group claimed responsibility, and a majority of the targets during these attacks were against the military, police, and other government actors. In terms of improvements, Mozambique recorded the largest decrease in deaths. They are still ranked 13th on the GTI, but during this time period did experience an 82% decrease in deaths. So this kind of accounts for the short-term counterterrorism measures against the Islamic State in this country. And then second, in terms of improvements, the decrease in Nigeria kind of accounts for the death of Boko Haram leader Abubakar Shekau in May 2021. But we still kind of have to see where activity will play out year by year, as it's reported that many Boko Haram members have left to join ISWA. So this next section in the report looks at decade-long trends in terrorism, not just looking at the results from the previous year. So this chart alludes to generally how the landscape of terrorism has changed regionally. So as we can see in yellow, deaths in terrorism have declined significantly since its peak in 2015. Yellow, decline of deaths in Iraq, but as you can see in green, the increase of deaths in the Sahel region. And then pointing out here in gray, we see the changes in deaths in both Europe and North America combined. You know, though terrorism in the West does pose a lot of different concerns, we do see that deaths in that area just generally make up a very small amount. Here we can see the insight into the deadliest terrorist groups over time. So the Islamic State does remain the deadliest terrorist group, as it has for the past 4 years. But as mentioned earlier, 52% of all terrorist incidents, as recorded in the terrorism tracker, they are not prescribed to a particular group. So this next section focuses on the shifting landscape, but really centering around how the Islamic State itself has changed over time, as well as its provinces and affiliates. So one of the key findings of not only this year's GTI, but past iterations as well, is that although the Islamic State is becoming less deadly, its activity is becoming more spread out. So we can see by 2020, the Islamic State had a deadly presence in over 25 countries versus back in 2014, its presence was in less than 5 countries. Here is just another chart that kind of reiterates that concept. We do see the peak of the Islamic State in 2015, but then, of course, afterwards you see its sharp decline. And then here in both blue, the dark blue, and the light blue, we see the emergence of the Islamic State in the Sahel region. And this last chart describes the same phenomenon, but from a regional perspective. So for the past 3 years, looking at 2019, 2020, and 2021, we do see that ISIS activity has become more split between 3 regions: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the MENA region, versus being, solely concentrated in the MENA region in the previous decades. And then focusing on the growing phenomenon of terrorism in the Sahel. In this particular report, we include 10 countries as being in the Sahel region. And then in terms of general findings, we do see that the Sahel region is now home to some of the fastest growing and deadliest terrorist groups. Both deaths and incidents are reaching their peak, as we can see. But on the right-hand side, we do see a sudden drop of deaths between 2015 and 2016. It's kind of difficult to say with certainty, but this drop is most likely the result from the hard counterterrorism operations, particularly those led by France. And so although we can see kind of a drop in deaths during that time period, we can see kind of the trend of increased terrorism in the Sahel increasing as groups start to reorganize and re-emerge. So it'd be very interesting to see how, this specific point of data will change over time. And then one of the interesting areas of analysis in regards to terrorism in the Sahel is the high presence of ecological threats in that area. So this is kind of one of my favorite aspects of the GTI in terms of analysis, because one of the other global indices that IEP produces is the Ecological Threat Register, which looks at various levels of ecological threat within a country, including food and water risk, rapid population growth, risk to natural disasters and temperature anomalies. So in addition to kind of seeing increased terrorist activity in the Sahel, this particular map overlaps it with recognition that the Sahel experiences some of the most extreme levels of ecological threat. So in terms of warning areas, we thought it was really important to feature this correlation just to see how these overlapping risks could drive conflict and insurgency. So kind of transitioning to seeing how results from this year's GTI showed the impact of terrorism in the West. We define the West more broadly as North America, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And in terms of emerging trends, here this particular chart separates attacks by ideology. And one of the things that I found quite interesting is that far left attacks actually outnumber far right attacks. But it's important to note that those attacks are actually much less deadly. So far left attacks more commonly target infrastructure, whereas far right attacks, majority of them target religious institutions and ethnic minority groups. In terms of fatalities, however, we've seen that religiously motivated terrorism causes the most amount of deaths in the West, followed by far-right motivated attacks. And then other key findings from this particular section. We have found that political terrorism has overtaken religiously motivated terrorism in some senses. There were 3 Islamist attacks in Europe in 2021, resulting in 2 deaths. And there were 7 recorded attacks in the US, none tied to a particular group. And then we did an analysis on similarities between both far right and far left terrorists. In terms of ideology, both of them target government actors. And we've noticed that, motivations stem from kind of similar places, feeling alienated from the larger system and having skepticism towards the so-called capitalist elite. So this is the last section of the presentation, which looks at some of the deeper, existing relationships between conflict, ultimately hoping to provide some data points and analysis that help articulate this link. So as an example, this chart here shows the proximity of terrorist attacks from armed conflict situations. So we see that 80% of all terrorist attacks that have been recorded in the terrorist tracker have occurred within 50 kilometers of an armed conflict situation. And then to bring the analysis into understanding these systems of terrorist groups. As many of you in this space might know, the lifespan of a terrorist group is very short. This graph here kind of shows the sharp decline in the number of active terrorist groups, both with a strong emergence in 2007 and in 2015, but just shows, in general, terrorist groups do kind of struggle to get the resources to operate. And so understanding the systems behind, these networks, I think is really important. And it's something that we try to go through in a general overview in the GTI. This is the last slide of my presentation. So the release of the new GTI did unfortunately coincide with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And as the invasion is still ongoing, it is hard to understand the impact this conflict may have. To kind of understand this, we did release a brief on the issue just to do a little bit of comparative analysis on how terrorist activity impacted Ukraine and also Georgia during the 2008 and 2014 conflict, and to see if there were any emerging trends that could be analyzed from there. So here are some quick statistics in terms of what is included in the brief, just looking at past trends in the region and in Ukraine. One of the sections that the brief talks about is the increase of cyber attacks in the lead up to the Ukraine invasion. So as kind of a final note and thinking to the future of future iterations of the GTI, cyber terrorism is something that is not yet included as data points in the Global Terrorism Index. But of course, this is an increasing point of conversation in this space. So as these threats start to emerge, and as hopefully we receive more universal frameworks on defining and collecting data points on this issue, I think it's going to be a really interesting section to kind of feature in the GTI. So leaving it on that end and looking to the future, I think is a good place to stop. Here is just a quick slide in terms of where you can find IEP on social media. Our website, Vision of Humanity, is where you can find all of the links to the reports, as well as today's PowerPoint presentation. But with that, Jack, I'll pass it over to you.
Great, Jessica, thank you so much for such a detailed presentation for today. I think you sort of shared a lot of information there. I was like scrambling, taking notes throughout. And one thing for our audience is I will make sure that these the publications, the reports are posted alongside the recording of today's webinar on ConnexUs. So to our audience, now is your time to shine. We're opening up to your questions. This is a discussion after all. A couple of notes about our format for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Thursday talks. You can submit a question in two ways. The first is through the question or chat function on your dashboard. The second is to click on the hand icon, which will raise your hand and allow us to unmute your microphone so that you can ask your question live. When you submit your question, we ask that you submit your name and affiliation. Just a note, these talks are recorded and will be posted on ConnexUs later today. So those who were not able to join us at this time can go back and listen to the presentation and the discussion. One thing that's sort of a bit clear from the questions, Jessica, that we've received so far is, like, how does IEP define terrorism? Just to sort of add a bit of context for some of these questions coming through.
In general, because the country rankings in itself, we do rely on a larger database. So this year we use the terrorism tracker, as I mentioned, produced by Dragonfly. And so let me pull up, I showed it in the slide, but I actually have it written down so that we can kind of get to the nitty-gritty of what the actual definition of terrorism that we use is. So this is not something that's produced by IEP. We actually, again, use the definition by Dragonfly, but we define it as the systemic threat or use of violence whether for or in opposition to established authority, with the intention of communicating a political, religious, or ideological message to a group larger than the victim group. And so one of the things that I kind of concentrate on in terms of just understanding what's counted in the GTI versus what might not be is, did the attack or incident try to convey a larger message? The impact of terrorism activity, I'd say as recorded on the GTI, is kind of conservative. For example, the terrorism tracker doesn't consider activities that a terrorist organization might do to gain resources. So for example, if they rob a bank or try to, gain resources in another way, that even though it's carried out by a terrorist organization, it's not exactly counted as an incident. So that's kind of what drives the definition and the way we approach data points in that perspective. So I think in general, it tries to remain as broad as possible, and to kind of include a lot of different actors that wouldn't have otherwise been included should we have used another type of definition.
Thanks, Jessica. That's really helpful context. A number of today's audience have shared in the questions that they're concerned about. They're based in sort of West Africa and the Sahel, and they've expressed concern at the sort of increase in terrorist activity. I know you touched on it briefly, but could you just elaborate a little bit more on sort of why, sort of what is it that you've seen an increase in, sort of what are the sort of the driving factors in that increase, and sort of the rise of the ISWA and sort of what their role has been in this?
Yeah, I think I somewhat feel qualified. It's definitely a hard question to answer, but I think looking at more of a top level perspective, one of the things that I found really interesting in terms of just new analysis on conflict in the Sahel was that overlapping of ecological threats and conflict and terrorist activity within the region. The data shows that, countries within the Sahel region are facing extreme pressure, both in terms of resource scarcity, in terms of rapid population growth, amongst, different types of interventions. I think that's definitely something to be focused on, not from just a counterterrorism perspective, but also from a peace building and development perspective as well. One of the interesting points that I see, coming out of these different trends is that although actors are imposing these very hard counterterrorism measures, we saw this in Boko Haram with the assassination of its leader, but we do see afterwards, these trends kind of start to, these organizations still start to emerge. So if there was something that I would feel qualified to say is that, intervention should really look at the long term and take it from a systemic approach. I don't know if, hard counterterrorism measures are the solution for long term, sustainability in this area, because we do see that groups are reemerging, they're moving to different countries, and so that has long-term implications.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Look, I think one of the challenges with today's presentation is that, we have a lot of people here with specific interests in specific countries. And I just want to, I appreciate you sort of making your best efforts to answer these questions, because I know a lot of them are very specific and specific to certain contexts. One, for example, comes from Rukhsana Rizvi, who writes about, given the terror attacks on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka, which happened in 2019, could you talk a little bit more about Sri Lanka's ranking and what it means? And I know, Jessica, you might not have this information on hand, so only answer that if you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on the specific activities that happen in Sri Lanka, but what I would encourage you is to see within the terrorism tracker, we do record, the deadliest attacks within a given year. And I do remember in past iterations of the report, for example, the 2020 and the 2019 GTI, there were bits of sections on terrorism more broadly in South Asia, because it was an emerging trend. And so I definitely encourage you to look at the different deteriorations, and I'd be happy to follow up via email to provide you any specific information that might be helpful in your analysis.
Great, thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Roxana, and to others that have sort of had questions around specific contexts. I think that, given sort of the depth of this report, it's incredibly challenging to try and deal with these in a live discussion. We can't all be experts on everything. So one of the things I just want to encourage is that we have a discussion forum set up on ConnexUs right now. If you have questions about a specific context, please feel free to add them there. This will be a community discussion. We'll also post the resources and the recording of today's webinar on that ConnexUs forum. So please feel free to go to that forum and add your questions, and we'll make sure that that's shared with Jessica and the team at IEP to discuss this further.
Yeah, on that point, Jack, I wanted to share that it's great to be involved in kind of learning dialogues as this. As you could see, the GTI is a very top level report, because we do look at things at the country and regional level. So it's always great to connect with subject matter experts who work more on the ground and who really know what's going on within their specific context.
Great. Well, Jessica, look, I appreciate you sort of providing that high-level overview. I think that there's obviously a lot. Like I said, I'm getting a lot of questions here from different people about specific contexts. So let's take all those country-specific questions and those context questions and take them to ConnexUs so that we continue this conversation over the next few weeks. We do have a question from Raylan Rowland, and Raylan is a student of a Master's of International Relations and Global Security at the American University School of International Studies. And Raylan asks, sort of, the data may be emerging, but is there any information to see about the Taliban takeover on the effects of global jihadism?
That's a really great question, actually. It's noted in the GTI that actually once the Taliban took over Afghanistan and became kind of the state control, unfortunately that's where the terrorism tracker data shifts a little bit, because it no longer becomes defined as unfortunately as a terrorist incident, and instead kind of becomes redefined in the lines of non-state versus state actors. So prior to the takeover of Afghanistan, we were tracking attacks, including the attack at Kabul airport. And so the way the data is going to kind of emerge from that in the next iteration of the GTI, I think will be really interesting in terms of what I might want to look at from my just general understanding. Now that the Taliban has become defined as a state actor, that doesn't mean that surrounding conflict within that area, or say rival groups, how will conflict look in that area in the next iteration of the GTI, and will we be able to track it using these kind of definitions? I think is a really interesting point of discussion.
And just to clarify, Jessica, how often do IEP produce the GTI?
So we produce it every year, annually. This year, when we kind of closed our data collection and started our research, was in December of 2021. So it was a really interesting time to kind of be stopping our data collection and starting to write because of the events that were going on in Afghanistan. So we can kind of expect maybe in a brief, but also in the next iteration of the GTI in 2023, analysis of where we've been able to kind of pick up on that data collection.
Great. Well, like I said, there's a lot of country-specific questions. I'm going to encourage everybody again to go to your chat function now on your GoToWebinar dashboard. You will have a link to the ConnexUs discussion forum. Add your questions there. We'll post a report. That's crowdsource a lot of this information, and I'll be sure to make sure we share this with Jessica. Jessica, I don't want to pester you with every single country that we're getting through the list, but I just want to take this opportunity to thank you for a great presentation There's so much information here that I think is relevant to a lot of the work that people are doing. And I know this is one of the first webinars I've done in a while where, instead of, audience reacting in certain ways, there's a lot of concern. So like I said, I just want to reiterate to our community and people online today is that we are here to learn together. And what we're trying to do is like improve the effectiveness of our work. So if you do have questions, please feel free to add them to ConnexUs. We'll continue this conversation, we'll learn together, and ultimately we'll try to make a positive impact in our communities. So let's dig into this information further. So with that, I'm just going to wrap things up for today. And Jessica, thanks again for such a detailed presentation, and thank you to IEP for continuing to produce these amazing pieces of research that are really, really helpful for our field. To everybody online, I'll see you on ConnexUs. The link is in your chat box. And thank you for joining. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be posted on ConnexUs later today. So please return to it, engage in a discussion. Let's learn together. Let's look at this data and let's talk about it. And yeah, so Jessica, thank you so much. Any last remarks for today's audience?
No, I want to thank you, Jack, and thank the entire ConnexUs team. It's been a pleasure to help kind of launch this, so to speak, and to help launch the Global Terrorism Index as well. And so I look forward to continuing that partnership.
Great. We look forward to hosting more conversations like this. Like I said, I'm seeing questions about Zimbabwe, about Myanmar, about Niger. Like, jump on the ConnexUs. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about each of these individually. Thanks so much, Jessica. Thank you to everybody. Take care, and we will see you soon.